Hello and welcome to another episode of Parker's Previews, part of Hit the Books on the Hammer Betting Network, powered by Circa Sports. Bet like the pros with the world's largest sports book right at your fingertips. Circa Sports. Experience big app bets with the highest betting limits, better moneyline splits with the lowest hold percentage, best customer service, and more. Sports betting on the go has never been better. Now you can download, fund, and bet like a pro from anywhere in Nevada. Get your new bookie today at circasports.com. Thanks for tuning back in again to our last show this season. A show where we are going to talk about the national championship game, which, as many of you may be aware, is pretty exciting for me, being a TCU alum, and just absolutely amazed that they got here, especially with a new coach and having been down the last couple of years. But a pretty fun matchup here between two teams who won their semifinal matchups, both more or less by the skin of their teeth. Two very competitive playoff games there, and a pretty interesting matchup again of what we see between a team who is dominant in terms of recruiting talent, in terms of quality of play, and a team who has made things work despite what other people perceive as limitations. So very fun mismatch of styles. We'll talk about that a little bit and talk about each of these teams, how they got there, their strengths and weaknesses, get to dive a little deeper on this game because this is, in fact, the only Division One FBS game we have this weekend. Certainly no disrespect to the FCS. That's just not something I have good data or insight on. So focusing on this one this weekend. TCU is sitting at between a 13.5 and a 12.5 underdog there. Not a lot of line movement, despite a lot of money coming in on TCU allegedly. You never know what's know about those. The public's betting X amount on Y. Like, how reliable are those? But we do know that that a lot of people have been talking about betting TCU as an underdog here. And if we look at the money line, TCU is plus 400, plus 380 in a couple places. So you can still get a pretty good value on TCU money line if that's the way you were going to line. And Georgia's down in the mid fours, minus 440, minus 445 at a couple different places as well. Finally, if we're looking at the total on this game, 62.5 is where it sits now. It has been as high as 63.5, I believe, is where it opens, and has come down a little bit. But again, not a ton of movement either on the spread or on the total for this game between these two teams. So without further ado, let's dive into it. 13-1 TCU taking on 14-0 Georgia, the Bulldogs. TCU is averaging 41.1 points per game. Georgia is averaging 39.4. TCU allowing 25. Georgia allowing a laughable, you hear me laughing because it's laughable, 12.8 points per game. That is including their game last week where they gave up 41 against Ohio State. So just absolutely absurd there. Both teams well over 450 yards of total offense. TCU at 474, Georgia at 494. TCU is 270 in passing, 205 rushing. Georgia is 293 passing, 201 rushing per game. And then on defense, TCU is allowing 385 yards per game to Georgia's 292.1. TCU 235 pass yards, Georgia 215, TCU 150 rush yards, Georgia 77 rush yards for Georgia. Looking at the last 5 games and kind of how we got here, TCU close win game day in Austin over Texas 17-10. We'll note that game looked a little closer than the final score, or the score looked a little closer than the finals than the game actually was. Texas had a fumble recovery for a touchdown at the very end. TCU walk-off field goal in Waco, winning back-to-back road games, winning against Baylor. A blowout of a really bad Iowa State team. Got to flex some muscle, got to run some plays that they hadn't run all season. Lost one score in overtime to Kansas State, and then won one score game against Michigan. If you're keeping track, that is 3-1 in 4 one-score games over their last 5. Georgia, on the other hand, 42-41 comeback against Ohio State. LSU 50-30 30 in a game that didn't even look as close as 20 points. They beat Georgia Tech 37-14. They beat Kentucky 16-6 in a pretty ugly game, and they beat Mississippi State 45-19. So I think between Texas, Baylor, Kansas State, Michigan, and Ohio State, LSU, Kentucky, Mississippi State, you could argue that TCU's had a rougher road here the last five games. The differences in schedules are what they are, but I think the perception is that Georgia has been battle tested in a really tough SEC schedule, and TCU has kind of waltzed in. But the reality is that TCU played 6 or 7 ranked games this season and managed to find a way to win all of them despite playing them all in an 11-game stretch right in a row with no byes. So definitely some differing paths to get here for both of these teams. TCU covered. Georgia did not in the semifinal. TCU won 51-45. They had a 56% success rate to Michigan's 45% success rate. I think a lot of people want to look at 2 pick sixes for TCU and say that was the ball game right there. Note TCU was even in turnovers, and most of Michigan's points came on short fields after turnovers. So turnovers kind of played the bug on both sides of the ball there as well. TCU averaged a negative 0.21 EPA per dropback, Michigan a negative 0.08. But where the difference was made, TCU 0.23 EPA per play against Michigan in the run game, Michigan negative 0.03 EPA per play in the run game against TCU. That was not what the narrative said was going to happen. That is not what folks thought was going to happen. And TCU runs 7 fewer plays, 5 fewer scrimmage plays than Michigan, and still manages to win a game and never trailed in that game. Georgia, on the other hand, they played Ohio State, and to varying degrees of success early on. They ended the half down 28-24. Georgia, tied things up at 21, kicked a field goal to go ahead. Ohio State gets a touchdown at the half to go 28-24, gets a touchdown the first drive out of the half after Georgia punts to go up 35-24. So you got an 11-point lead there. They kick a field goal again after teams trade. Georgia misses a field goal on a pretty short field after a good punt return, and ends up going out to 38-24. So 14-point lead there. Georgia field goal, touchdown to win the game. Ohio State went punt, went field goal, and then missed a field goal to lose the game. So perhaps the mismanagement on Ohio State's side, definitely inability to kind of close out the deal. All they needed was one more touchdown in their last, 5 drives in the second half. If they just scored a touchdown on one of those, they would have won this game. So definitely a close loss, but I do think that Georgia's athletes definitely took over in both of those games. So different levels of wins, different levels of confidence going into this game. TCU, again, a double-digit underdog in this spot. Let's talk about some of the advanced stats. Let's get into the preview here and talk about how some of these teams are or how these teams are matching up on some of these stats. Let's get this all where it looks pretty and you can see it. Get our little dragger. There we go. Okay, so TCU 19th in EPA per play. They're 17th in offense, 50th in defense. Georgia, on the other hand, they are 2nd in EPA per play margin, 9th on offense, 7th on defense. Very, very balanced. Great units. Offense took a big step forward over the offseason. Defense took a tiny step back, but it's almost impossible to not take a step back from what was an historic run for them. So in 2021, that defense. If we go to some of our other big play stats, TCU 21st in net points per drive. They're 19th in points per drive on offense, but they are 47th in points per drive on defense. So they do give up a few points there. Their net field position, they're 22nd. They're rushing 1.4% more than the average team. They do have very good game control with this 56.1 echo ratio. Remember, that's just the ratio of all quality possessions in the game that belong to you. So in every game that TCU's played, 56.1% of quality possessions have belonged to them. We know those quality possessions correlate very highly with scoring, as football is a game of opportunity as much as it is a game of capitalizing on that opportunity. Net points per drive. For Georgia, they are third, 1.73, eighth on offense, and interestingly enough, eighth on defense there. So very balanced from Georgia relative to their peers. They're 11th in net field position, a little bit more pass heavy than TCU, negative 1.0 rush rate over expected. That's 58th in the nation. And they are, again, similarly very good in controlling games. They're eighth in echo ratio with 59.4% of quality possessions staying being generated by the Bulldogs in that game. Let's start talking about the TCU offense versus the Georgia defense. I think the biggest thing that stands out here as we're looking is we look at their success rate and we look at their EPA per play, and we see a pretty interesting split here. Pretty interesting split. Notably, TCU 55th in EPA per play, 55th in success rate, 17th in EPA per play, 83rd in offensive passing success rate, 37.4% success rate, but they're 30th in EPA per pass, averaging 0.137 EPA per pass. So definitely a boom and bust passing offense. They want to hit the big play. They have trouble generating consistent success through the pass game. The ground game is going to matter a whole lot. They're much more balanced. It's 26th in success rate, 18th in EPA per rush. If we are talking about the TCU Horned Frogs and we're talking about their receiving game, we have to talk about how Georgia's going to match up on Quentin Johnston. 78 targets for Quentin Johnston, leading the team. That's almost a little more than a fifth of their team's targets, 15.6 yards per reception this season. If we count the postseason, he's at 18.0 yards per reception. Has really done great in the Kansas State and the Michigan games, 94 total targets there, which is about 1/4 of the team's total this season, and a pretty solid 3.22 yards per route run on a 12.9 average depth of target. The TCU offense is going to go as far as Quentin Johnston goes. That'll be a huge matchup to watch. Can Georgia contain him? And then how, when Georgia devotes extra attention to Quentin Johnston, can they come back and find some of these second options? Darius Davis, Tay Barber, Tavion Williams, Jared Wiley, Kendre Miller in the pass game, the running back, who we'll talk about in a minute. I mean, can they find those guys? Is going to be the really, really important question there. TCU in their pass game has been led by, of course, Max Duggan, who's having just an excellent season, the culmination of his career, 63.6% completion percentage, 8.9 yards per attempt, 9.7 average depth of target, 21 big-time throws to only 12 turnover-worthy plays, and an 86.0 offensive grade from PFF. The other thing I want to talk about as we transition out of passing into the rushing game is Max Duggan's legs. He has 84 attempts this season, which is down from his average. We're going to watch a lot. He had 118 yards against Kansas State as he kind of willed them to victory. He had 63 yards against Michigan, kind of icing the game there as well. We're going to talk about totals and sides here in a minute, but I think there's some interesting lines you can get for like Max Duggan over 24 rushing yards, which would be interesting because I think that as the offense kind of breaks down against a better defense, you're going to see a lot of Max Duggan scrambling. Of course, in the run game, Kendre Miller, supposedly healthy, going to play for TCU, leads the team 6.2 yards per attempt, 17 touchdowns, 3.64 yards after contact, which is going to be really, really important against this Georgia team. 38 runs of 10 plus yards or more. So weapons all around, kind of the big three: Duggan, Miller, Johnston will dictate a lot of what TCU can do on offense. But look for some names maybe you're not as familiar with as they as they try to get more innovative if Georgia can shut down those main options. TCU 16th in, let's see how they match up EPA per play. Georgia, of course, excellent in defensive success rate, 10th overall. Slightly worse against the pass and the rush, 36th in passing success rate allowed, 6th in rushing success rate allowed. So that'll be interesting, especially as we look at their EPA. They're slightly worse against the pass. We saw that a mobile quarterback with a big arm, CJ Stroud, can be exploited. They're 33rd in EPA per pass, averaging just under 0 allowed in expected value, and they're second in EPA per rush. So run game against Georgia is going to be very hard for TCU to generate. Can they get anything on this relatively weaker pass defense here? Quality possession rate, TCU 16th, Georgia 17th, very, very similar. Georgia prevents finishing drives a little bit better. They're 3.11 points, which is 7th in the nation. TCU is finishing them at a rate of 4.58, which is 19th in the nation. So not bad at all. Slight field position advantage to Georgia. They allow opponents to start at the 26.3. TCU on average starts at the 30.9. And lastly, I want to look at the early down, late down splits. I think this is really important. TCU 15th in early downs EPA. They're 65th in third and fourth down success. The key for TCU is, can they avoid these third and long situations where Georgia can really mess them up? I think that this offense is really going to be going through it this game, and it's going to be pretty tough. They're going to have to get pretty innovative to compete here, but especially if they find themselves in these third and long situations. Georgia's third in third down success allowed, 29.7. They just do not let you convert those downs. That's going to be big for TCU. One, to keep their defense off the field, but two, to sustain drive. So looking at TCU's offense plays, I'm thinking about Max Duggan over rushing yards. I think you can get that at 24 yards, 26 yards. Be happy with either of those. Longest touchdown over 47 yards, I think, is where I've seen this is a really good play there as well, because if TCU is going to score, which I think they are, I do think they're good for one big play touchdown against Georgia, at least. That to me is pretty interesting. One other thing to note is that TCU has a pretty great punt returner in Darius Davis. This season, he is averaging 14.9 yards per punt return, which is 4th in the nation. He has 2 touchdowns. Georgia ranks 129th in the nation with 18.3 punt return yards allowed. So special teams might matter there. TCU get a spark for sure. That's from my friend Colin Post, who covers TCU. He pulled that stat, but that was on my radar. And I really think that the 3 bets I'm looking at in terms of props are Duggan over touchdown over 47 yards and a defensive or special team score. Yes, that's going to give you any interception, pick six, any fumble, any safety, but that's also going to give you the possibility of TCU exploiting this matchup with Darius Davis making a big punt return as well. Let's go to the other side of the ball and talk about Georgia on offense. Notice they are much better at passing than they are rushing. Third in success rate overall. First in passing, 17th in rushing. In EPA per pass, they're second in passing efficiency, averaging 0.324 EPA per play when they pass. That is amazing. That's astounding. That is increasing their value by 1/3 of a point every time they pass the ball is absolutely incredible. TCU, a little bit worse against the pass, 60th than they are the rush, 42nd. Key to note about pacing, and part of the reason I have such a low projection here is that Georgia really runs to just raise their floor and keep the ball moving, staying on schedule. They're not looking for explosive runs. They're not looking for big plays. They'll beat you over the top of the pass if they have to, but I think it's very possible that Georgia gets in a positive game state here and just runs the ball and runs the clock out and takes the victory here, tries to give TCU as few opportunities as possible. TCU's defense, the 3-3-5 is a little bit more confusing than a lot of people think, and certainly showed up against Michigan. Will require something out of Georgia's offensive line, but Georgia's offensive line is pretty deep, and they do simplicity well. I think that's really, really important for this game. So they can be exploited, TCU's defense. We'll see how Georgia can kind of match them up. Georgia quarterback Stetson Bennett on the season is having, again, a pretty good year. Maybe not as good. Certainly more yards this year. Certainly more attempts this year than last year. They feel a little bit more comfortable with him. But 8.6 yards per attempt, 19 big time throws to 10 turnover worthy plays, an average depth of target of just 9.1, and doing great this season. A really, really good system, an 84.8 offensive grade from PFF. So a really great system for Stetson Bennett. Clearly in the offseason, they've had time to work. And I think overall, that he's really settled in, and having this kind of like calm presence has been just really, really good for their offense because they have so much talent around him. Their leading receivers this season, Ladd McConkey, who's a little bit hurt, might be limped up, but should play, I believe. 13.2 yards per reception, 4 touchdowns. Brock Bowers, the just very multiple tight end, 64 targets. He's got 14.0 yards per reception and 5 of their touchdowns. Washington and McIntosh, the other tight end and the running back, are very prolific in the pass game. 39 targets each, combined for over 800 yards and 2 touchdowns. So they've got 4 very, very solid options, and then a bunch of guys who are just, very, very good depth behind them. A.D. Mitchell will be back for Georgia. That provides another deep threat kind of downfield for them. So it'll be interesting to see how they use that, especially if, for instance, Washington can't play. What kind of formation is Georgia going to come out in? I think the conventional wisdoms, they're going to come out in a, 2 tight end set and be very, very physical. They might spread it out a little bit and just see if they can test this TCU defense. Again, Georgia finishing drives very, very well. 4th at 5.01 points per Eckel. TCU at 3.78 points per Eckel. That's 41st in the nation. Slight advantage for field position for TCU. They've done well with turnovers and turnover margin. Georgia really hasn't taken the ball away a ton, and TCU has done pretty well at not turning it over and not putting their defense in bad positions there. So TCU average start of 27.5 on defensive drives, Georgia 30.8. Very, very even, both teams on early and late downs. TCU is 50th in early downs EPA, 35th in 3rd and 4th down success. And Georgia is 12th in early downs EPA and 6th in 3rd and 4th down success. So a really interesting matchup here. I like Georgia for an over, or Stetson Bennett for an over for passing yards, I think, as a prop here. And 2 teams who really are differently matched in such a way that it's going to be really, really interesting to watch this. So to recap, a couple plays I've given out that I like, just if you're into props. I don't do this a ton, but Duggan over rushing, if you can get that in the mid-20s. He hasn't rushed a ton this season, but as the offense collapses, I think gets stress test, he will run more. You have anytime touchdown of defense or special teams, I think is a really good bet here. And the longest touchdown being over 46 yards. Both of these offenses are so explosive. That seems like that's going to go to the bank. As for a play, my numbers have an under, but again, long games in the national championship, it's kind of a ride or die situation. You might get more possessions due to some variance as teams press. So I'm staying off the total. I have Georgia at about 11 projected. That's not enough to make me bet TCU outright. But I do think this will be a close game. So I would look at a first half line. I think Georgia can really separate in the second half. I'm seeing a first half line of TCU plus 7.5. That would be my official play this week, is get that first half line, because the second half, that's really where Georgia can separate, and there might be some value in TCU, but not if if in the whole game it could really get away from them. So that has been a quick just a quick rundown of kind of the advanced stats here of the national championship. A really interesting game. We'll be watching. We'll definitely be playing some of those props. This has been Parker's Previews, part of Hit the Books on the Hammer Betting Network, powered by Circa Sports. Bet like the pros with the world's largest sports book right at your fingertips. Circa Sports. Experience big app bets with the highest betting limits, better money line splits with the lowest hold percentage, best customer service, and more. Get your new bookie today at circasports.com. Thanks so much for listening this season. Best of luck with your bets this weekend, and I'm sure we'll see each other soon.